The Confederacy's insurrection, such as Sekulow's Civil War, is the use of political violence by secret subversions and arbitrary functions of terrorism. And as systematic insurrection, they engage in their Fugitive Slave Act functions for their slave raids without justification or cause, manufacturing a foundless basis of their insurrection with a light distraction which, having no substantive advantage, can be misplaced for the purpose of slander and defamation, at which point their position of slave raids having necessary enforcement in order to engage in the arbitrary subversion of rights for the artificial mechanism of engaging in the economy for the wizard communism, substantively changing the form and shape of the United States economy, generates a systems of subversions to checks and balances in the engagement and endorsement of arbitrary terrorism, as was manufactured in the Middle East, trained by the white nationalists, at which point the trained, perfected strategies exponentially compounded on themselves would be the foundation of their engagement, which includes the trades for their donkey fucking and their pedophilia fucking as the mechanism of their insurrections are historically transferable. Now, the position inside the Middle East includes many references, such as the compulsion. Uh, it was like some Middle Eastern movie about a uh, kite fighters or something like this, but it makes a reference of something that's functionally happening from the training of the white nationalists into the engagement of the phantom cells, which has terrorists coming into the presumption of CIA functions for their own version of the intelligence actions as is trained by the CIA white nationalist operatives, which is actively being used inside the United States, advancing local and higher uh, law enforcement into the same techniques as they become the same type of terrorist functions as the ones manufactured in the Middle East. Now, their engagement includes the common threat of the extortion, which would have, a terrorist would go in and they would say, "Give us our preferred boys and we will give you soup." At which point, they're starving people and the orphans not being able to find it other ways can have all of the children taken, or you can give them the children that they're asking for in exchange for food to feed the rest of them. At which point, this being a common trade, normalized by the psychopaths, supporting J. Sekulow's mentality in his Insurrectionist Civil War, manufactures the arbitrary political and social violence for the mechanism of permanent protected hate crimes through the mechanism of their surveillance insurrectionists for their wizard communism, manufacturing catastrophic, permanent, arbitrary threats against the general public, including the act of human trafficking, which engages in the defamation of the victim, which would serve only the interest of framing them for the arbitrary sales and distributions of the black market in order to acquiring funding for the war, at which point the act of selling and distributing permits for the defamation and injuries in order to fund the war. You have the permanent series of rackets, including the fraudulent arrangements of false charities which have no interest of actually assisting, or psychologists who, having no interest in therapy, actively engage in the subversion of the obligation to the service of law at the arbitrary extortion of the double agent terrorists who, compromising the various departments, might very well be police officers disloyal to their country and to the office that they swore to, at which point, having no subjugation to law, do not serve the law, and are thus terrorist insurgents without a legal government, formless, baseless, and arbitrary in infinite diversities, as exclusively a terrorist public threat, requiring national security to engage in lethal retaliation in order to engage in the baseline security necessary for a stable people who can operate in a reasonable assumption of survivable society, at which point you have the engagement of the arbitrary terrorism, who, being in the eyes of George W. Bush, from his quote, everyone who aids and abets terrorists is an enemy of war to the United States, requiring the position of them having voted for the insurrection of becoming an enemy of war to the United States from the expectation of the public at the time of the case generates their arbitrary insurrections as the compulsion to the immediate arrest and dismantlement of their total group existence, at which point the engagement of all of the subversions, such as the subversion of contracts, such as their engagement of the subversion of winnings, facilitates the position that their obstruction in order to make the defamation, in order to make the extortion, in order to deplete the accounts, will take someone who engages in a contest who is owed winning a prize of some kind to not receive that prize in order to engage in the coercion of the threat, by the taking of the property that is owed to them, by the dirty tricks and subversion, manufacturing the artificial market by coercion and threat, at which point the wizard terrorism engages in the wizard communism, manufacturing substantive different results than was produced from the market, changing the meritocracy into the arbitrary, mindless catharsis of the insurrectionists, which cannot be satisfied in any level as it is an unending addiction. The addiction feeds the addiction, feeds the addiction, feeds the addiction. It is a circular logic. One thing requires the other thing, requires the other thing, requires the first thing, as it consistently circles around in requiring the perpetual existence of itself in order to perpetuate itself, manufacturing the conclusion of uh, the false justification, which is uh, a non-argument as their foundational position in distractions and bluster. As bluster is their entire position, they, like all Marxist theologists, do not have the capacity to engage in a real, competent argument, which is the purpose of their obstruction of justice, as to prevent the actual functioning argument of what would actually be occurring during those engagements, servicing the fruit of the poison tree as the mechanism of the fraud, as fraud is the foundation of the entirety of everyone who supported or voted for it, as they have no inherent intellectual, competent, redeeming qualities. At which point, the obstruction of justice being ignored would compel them into a reasonable argument, which they would by nature ignore in favor of their actual functioning policy, which is insurrection and the destruction of the United States for its enemies, foreign and domestic, at which point the sales and distribution of the United States to all enemies, foreign and domestic, facilitates the mechanism of their profits by having been the ones to have provided the capacity to have taken the pieces of the overthrown foreign nation. The white nationalists in the Middle East are the terrorists of the Middle East, and that is who is functionally here. So those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, as the terrorists responsible for the 9/11 attacks, are the ones backing Jay Sekulow to overthrow the United States by his arbitrary war for the sake of war, engages in the position of the slavery raids, which facilitates the systematic terrorism of the dismantlement of this society and its governments, systematically replacing the entirety of the United States for the sales and distribution to the highest bidder, facilitating their sales of high-grade security mechanisms of the United States to its enemies in order to engage in malicious oppressions and war crimes against the United States public, making them systematically more vulnerable as is oppressed by the function of the former American equipment turned against the American people, at which point the position of government is the people are independently sovereign as individuals, and their agreement to service of law is the removing of their sovereignty as a person in favor of the mutual contract in the agreement. And the mechanism of having made that mutual agreement means they could only give permission to things that they had authority to do to each other as sovereign, at which point the subversion of that agreement by the exceeding of that in color of law and color of office maintains the mechanism of the foundation of the argument of those who voted for the terrorist insurrectionist civil war, at which point the complete rejection of the entirety of all American law and every constitutional function, including the right to not become a slave without due process or the existence of due process, period, or the function of the preservation of life, which is existence and human decency without the change of status, without the function of due process, which is disqualified by the nature of the obstruction of justice of maintaining secrets which are essential to the function of it by the use of some nonsense distraction argument, such as sources and methods not being released to the courts for the court of record in order to correctly discern the fair position as their utter contempt for fairness, because some bullshit nonsense distraction like a fare is a taxi payment, and their bullshit rejection of all competent functions of engagement of their office makes them arbitrary insurrectionist terrorists, giving them unlimited diversity, objectives with purposes without base or justification, manifests the infinite threat of the armed terrorist lawless piracy, which is the insurrectionist policy, at which point not having the right to life includes the position of not having the right to liberty, which is the existence of freely being able to exist without being perpetually harassed by the surveillance terrorist engagements, which is functionally human trafficking, which is the subversion of all liberty, at which point the engagement of that is the destruction of the entire free market society. And with the barring of the right to liberty or self-determination, you have the barring of the right to self-determination, or the right to pursue your own happiness, at which point the active obstructions and robberies, such as the subversions of winnings in contests, facilitates the artificial changing in the foundation of all social engagements, as the normalized position of winning in a contest would assert uh, the arbitrary social engagements for the position of social status, at which point the objective of the subversion of social status is the subversion of human decency, is the subversion of association, coercion against the existence of the associations by the prevention of the asserting of the hierarchy in various winnings, such as the winnings in a series of games or in a drawing or something along these lines, the mutual celebration and the dividing of resources amongst a victory, generating the celebration based pizza party. These types of arrangements systematically generate the normalized social engagements at every level of society, at which point the attack against the broadest foundation of social engagements is the complete eradication of the concept of the existence of that free society, manifesting arbitrary, complete, baseless, non-justified violence, which is infinitely diverse for anything, for any reason, or no reason at all, including race, which is their foundational act of policies, uh, in culmination with Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, which, engaging in insurrection against the United States, has at its core the utter hatred of all things America, which is, in fact, the realization and the manifestation of the white nationalist systematic racism, which is wizard communism, which is centrally planned economy, manufacturing winners and losers on the basis of non-meritocracy advantages, at which point the assertion of their neo-feudalism is the generation of a permanent injury against the possibility of any American activity to success for anyone anywhere.